The observation room was silent, but the air was heavy with fear. High above the cold metal floor, the leaders of the Galactic Union watched through a thick wall of reinforced glass. They were looking down into room 402. Inside that room sat a human named Elias and a creature of the galaxy called the Shadow Fong. To the aliens watching, the creature was a nightmare. It was a juvenile Korgon, a predator born on a planet where the trees tried to eat you and the rain was acidic. Even though it was only a cub, it had 4 eyes that glowed like dying embers and claws that could slice through starship plating. It was hunched in the corner, its scales wet with sweat, growling a sound that vibrated in the bones of everyone watching. "This is a mistake," whispered Commander Vark, a tall alien with blue skin and 3 eyes. "Humans are supposed to be smart. Why is he sitting there? The beast is hungry. It is terrified. It will kill him." The other scientists nodded. In the Galactic Union, there was a simple rule. If something bites you, you kill it. If something threatens you, you destroy it. This was how the galaxy survived. But humans were different. Humans were from Earth, the death world. They were famous for being the most dangerous fighters in the stars. Yet here was Elias, sitting cross-legged on the floor, wearing nothing but a simple cotton shirt and trousers. He had no armor. He had no gun. Elias held a small piece of dried meat in his hand. He didn't move. He didn't even blink. "Hey there, little guy," Elias said. His voice was a low, soft rumble. It wasn't the voice of a soldier. It was the voice of a father. The Korgon Cub didn't understand the words, but it felt the vibration. It hissed, revealing rows of needle-sharp teeth. It had been captured by hunters weeks ago. It had been poked with electric prods and kept in a dark cage. To the cub, every living thing was an enemy. Every hand was a hand that brought pain. Suddenly, the cub moved. It was a blur of black scales and fury. The aliens behind the glass gasped. Some turned away, expecting to see a massacre. The cub lunged across the room and sank its teeth deep into Elias's left forearm. The sound was sickening, the crunch of teeth meeting flesh. Blood, bright red and warm, began to soak into Elias's sleeve and drip onto the white floor. "Security! Open the doors! Neutralize the specimen!" Commander Vark shouted into his comms. The guards outside the room gripped their plasma rifles. They were ready to rush in and vaporize the cub to save the human diplomat. But Elias didn't scream. He didn't jump up. He didn't grab the cub's throat to crush it. "Wait!" Elias shouted, his voice echoing in the room. He looked directly at the camera in the corner, his face pale from the sudden shock of pain, but his eyes were steady. "Stay back. Do not open that door." The cub was still locked onto his arm. It was shaking its head, trying to tear the muscle. It expected the human to hit it. It expected the human to fight back. It was waiting for the blow that would end its life, because that was the only world it knew. But the blow never came. Elias took a deep, shaky breath. He looked down at the small, trembling creature attached to his arm. He could feel the cub's heart beating fast, like a hummingbird. He could feel the creature shivering with pure, unfiltered terror. Slowly, so slowly that the cameras almost didn't catch it, Elias moved his right hand. "He going for the neck," an alien scientist whispered. "He going to snap it." But Elias didn't reach for the neck. He reached for the top of the cub's head, right between its glowing eyes. His fingers touched the rough, jagged scales. The cub flinched, its eyes widening. It waited for the pain. Instead, Elias began to stroke the cub's head. His touch was light and warm. "It's okay," Elias whispered, even as his blood continued to flow. "I know it hurts. I know you're scared. You're not alone anymore." The cub froze. Its jaws didn't let go, but the biting stopped. It tilted its head, confused. No one had ever touched it like this. This wasn't a strike. This wasn't a grab. This was something else. Then Elias did the unthinkable. He leaned forward and wrapped his arms around the predator. He pulled the sharp, bleeding creature into his chest, burying his face in its cold scales. He gave the monster a hug. Behind the glass, the aliens stood in total shock. To them, this was madness. A human was hugging a creature that was literally eating him. "Is he suicidal?" Vark asked, his voice trembling. "No," a senior researcher replied, staring at the screen in awe. "Look at the cub." Inside the room, the Korgon Cub's eyes began to dim from a bright, angry red to a soft amber. Its body, which had been as stiff as stone, slowly began to relax. The teeth finally slid out of Elias's arm. The cub didn't run away. It stayed there, tucked into the human's embrace. A small, chirping sound came from the cub's throat. It was a cry for help. Elias closed his eyes, holding the monster tighter. He knew the galaxy was watching. He knew they thought he was crazy. But he also knew something they didn't. Sometimes, the only way to stop a war is to refuse to fight. The blood was still dripping, the wound was deep, and the danger was far from over. But in that moment, the most dangerous predator in the room wasn't the Korgon. It was the human who had mastered the power of mercy. The audience behind the glass watched in silence, wondering, what kind of species is this? The silence in the observation deck was heavy. None of the alien leaders moved. They watched the screen, where the bleeding human continued to hold the deadly predator. On any other planet, this would be the end of the story. The predator would finish its meal, or the human would kill the beast in self-defense. But Elias just sat there, his blood staining the cub's scales, whispering words that no one else could hear. Commander Vark finally found his voice. This is not biology. This is a malfunction of instinct, he snapped, his 3 eyes blinking in agitation. He turned to the lead scientist, a frail creature with long fingers. Explain this. Why hasn't the human retaliated? Human history is full of war and fire. They are known for their rage. Why is he leaking emotion for a monster? The scientist adjusted his glasses, his hands shaking as he pulled up Elias's medical files. We studied their history, Commander, but we missed their heart. Humans have a strange concept called empathy. They can feel the pain of another being as if it were their own. It is a biological glitch that shouldn't exist in a top-tier predator. Inside the room, the cub began to pull back. It looked up at Elias with its 4 amber eyes for the first time in its short, violent life. It wasn't being hunted. It wasn't being shocked by prods. It smelled the copper scent of Elias's blood, the very blood it had drawn, and yet the human was still petting it. The cub let out a soft, confused hiss. It sniffed Elias's wounded arm, then looked at his face. Elias didn't flinch. He didn't pull his arm away. He let the cub investigate the damage it had caused. Yeah, that hurts a bit, buddy, Elias said with a small, tired laugh. But I've had worse. You're just a kid who doesn't know any better. The cub tilted its head. It didn't understand English, but it understood the lack of threat. It slowly sat down, its long tail twitching. It was no longer a monster. It was just a confused animal. The council members were arguing now. Some wanted to gas the room to save Elias from his own madness. Others were fascinated. A general from a warrior race stepped forward, his armor clanking. If a human can tame a Korgon with a touch, imagine what they could do to us. This is a weapon. They are showing us that they can dominate even the most violent spirits without firing a shot. It is a display of ultimate power. But the scientist shook his head. No, General. He isn't trying to dominate. He is trying to heal. Look at his heart rate. The monitors showed Elias's heart was slowing down, even though he was losing blood. He was calm. He was at peace. The human was teaching the galaxy a lesson they weren't ready to learn. That the greatest strength isn't the ability to destroy, but the choice not to. Suddenly, a red light began to flash in the observation deck. An alarm blared, cutting through the tension. Warning, containment breach, the station SAI announced. The heavy blast doors at the far end of the room groaned. Someone on the outside, perhaps a faction that hated humans or feared the Korgons, had triggered a manual override. The door began to slide open. Beyond that door was the rest of the station, filled with thousands of defenseless civilians and diplomats. If the cub ran out now, it would be hunted down and killed within seconds. Or worse, it would kill someone else, starting a war between Earth and the Galactic Union. Elias stood up. He staggered for a second, his face turning a bit gray from the blood loss. The cub immediately stood up too, its back arching, its claws sliding out. It saw the open door as an escape, or perhaps a new place to fight. It growled, a deep sound that echoed in the hallway. Elias looked at the open door, then at the cub. He knew he had to make a choice. He could let the guards handle it, which meant the cub would die. Or he could do something even more dangerous than a hug. Stay with me, Elias commanded. It wasn't a whisper anymore. It was the voice of a leader. He stepped between the cub and the open door, turning his back to the predator. He was completely vulnerable. The aliens behind the glass held their breath. By turning his back, Elias was giving the cub a perfect chance to bite his neck and kill him instantly. It was the ultimate test of trust. The cub looked at the open door, sensing freedom. Then it looked at the back of the man who had hugged it. The hallway outside filled with the sound of running boots and the clicking of weapons. The security teams were coming. They wouldn't see a scared cub. They would see a beast to be slaughtered. Elias held out his hand behind him, not looking back. Trust me, little one. The world out there isn't ready for you yet, but I am. The cub took a step toward the door, its eyes glowing red again. Then it stopped. It looked at Elias's hand. Slowly, the predator moved forward and pressed its cold, scaly nose into the palm of the human's hand. It chose the man over the exit. The security team rounded the corner, their rifles aimed. Fire, the lead guard shouted. But before a single plasma bolt could leave the barrels, Elias stepped fully into the doorway, shielding the cub with his own body. Lower your weapons, he roared. His voice was so loud it shook the glass of the observation deck. The guards froze. They were elite soldiers, but they had never seen a human look so terrifying and so protective at the same time. Elias stood there, blood dripping from his sleeve, his eyes burning with a fierce light. This beast is under the protection of the United Earth government. If you fire on him, you fire on humanity. In the observation deck, Commander Vark sank into his chair. He realized that the galaxy had completely misunderstood humans. They weren't dangerous because they liked to fight. They were dangerous because they would protect the monsters of the universe with the same ferocity they used to protect their own children. The Shadow Fawn cub sat behind Elias's legs, hiding. It had found its pack, and that pack was a single, bleeding, stubborn human. The experiment was over, but the mystery had only just begun. Who were these humans, really? And what else were they capable of? As the guards slowly lowered their guns, Elias turned around and knelt beside the cub again. He was weak, but he smiled. See, I told you. We're a team now. But as he spoke, he collapsed. The blood loss was too much. As Elias hit the floor, the cub didn't run. It let out a roar of pure grief that shook the entire station. The medical bay of the galactic station was usually a place of quiet science, but today it was a zone of chaos. Elias lay on a hovering bio bed, his face the color of ash. Doctors from 3 different star systems worked frantically to stop the bleeding in his arm. But they had a massive problem. They weren't alone in the room. In the corner, huddled under a metal table, was the Korgon Cub. It refused to leave. Every time a medical droid or an alien nurse got too close to Elias, the cub would let out a low, vibrating snarl that cracked the glass of the nearby medicine cabinets. It wasn't hunting. It was guarding. The predator that had bitten Elias was now his self-appointed bodyguard. We cannot treat the human if that beast stays there, yelled the head surgeon, a spindly alien with 4 arms. It is a biohazard. It is a killer. Commander Vark stood by the door, watching the monitors. He saw the way the cub's eyes never left Elias's chest, watching the slow rise and fall of the human's breath. Vark felt a strange chill. It isn't a killer anymore, Vark whispered. It is a sentry. It thinks we are the threat. Vark realized that the human hadn't just tamed the creature. He had rewritten its soul. The Korgon species was known for being solitary, cold, and violent. They didn't have a word for friend. They didn't have a word for loyalty. Yet, this cub was risking its life to stay by a dying alien's side. Inside the cub's mind, the world was a blur of smells and sounds. It smelled the chemicals of the room, the fear of the blue-skinned aliens, and the sweet, heavy scent of Elias's blood. But mostly, it remembered the warmth. It remembered the feeling of the human's arms, a sensation of safety it hadn't felt since its mother was killed by poachers. To the cub, Elias was no longer a human. Elias was the source of heat, the source of peace, and the source of the strange, rhythmic humming that had calmed the storm in its brain. The cub saw the doctors moving toward Elias with sharp needles. In the cub's world, sharp objects meant pain. It lunged out from under the table, snapping its jaws inches from a doctor's hand. Enough. A voice boomed. The door slid open, and a woman walked in. She was wearing the dark blue uniform of the Earth Command. This was Captain Sarah Reed, the human representative on the station. She didn't look at the aliens. She looked at the cub. She didn't scream or draw a weapon. Instead, she reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, worn-out tennis ball. She tossed it onto the floor. The cub froze, watching the yellow object bounce. "He's going to be okay, little guy," Sarah said softly, her voice mirroring Elias' calm tone. "But you have to let them help him. If he dies, who else going to give you those hugs you like so much?" The cub looked at the ball, then at the woman, then back at Elias. It seemed to understand the gravity of the situation. With a final, mournful whine, the creature retreated into the shadows of the corner, resting its head on its paws. It watched. It waited. The doctors rushed in, finally able to apply the regenerative gel to Elias' arm. As they worked, Captain Reed turned to Commander Vark. Her face was hard, like carved stone. "You people were going to kill that child," she said, her voice dripping with disgust. "You saw a monster because that's what you expected to see. Elias saw a baby because that's what humans do." Vark stepped closer, his eyes narrow. "Captain, you must understand. The Korgon are the most violent species in the neutral zone. They have destroyed entire colonies. Why would a human risk his life, and potentially a diplomatic war, for one cub? It makes no logical sense. The cost is too high." Sarah Reed looked at the monitor showing Elias' heart rate. "Logic didn't get us to the stars, Commander. Curiosity did. And mercy kept us from burning our own planet to the ground before we got here. We don't care about the cost of a life. We care about the life itself. That cub is the last of its bloodline. Its mother was killed for her scales. If we let it die, we lose a piece of the universe. Humans don't like losing." As the hours passed, the news of what happened in room 402 spread across the station like a wildfire. Thousands of aliens from hundreds of worlds were watching the leaked footage on their personal devices. They saw the bite. They saw the blood. And then they saw the hug. The video was being shared across the galactic net with a single title: Asterisk the human choice. Asterisk for many species who lived under the cold, hard laws of the Galactic Union. This was a revelation. They began to gather outside the medical bay. They weren't there to protest or to demand the cub be killed. They were there because they were curious. They wanted to see the man who had broken the laws of nature. Deep in the night, the lights in the medical bay dimmed to a soft blue. Elias stirred. His fingers moved, brushing against the cold sheets. Immediately, a heavy weight pressed against the side of his bed. The cub had jumped up, its 4 eyes glowing in the dark. It nudged Elias' hand with its snout. Elias opened his eyes slowly, his vision blurry. He felt the rough scales against his palm and smiled. "Hey," he croaked, his throat dry. "You're still here." The cub let out a soft, purring vibration, a sound no scientist had ever recorded a Korgon making. It was the sound of a predator learning to love. But the peace didn't last. The station's internal speakers crackled to life. A cold, mechanical voice filled the air. "By order of the High Council, the specimen known as Shadow Fong is to be seized for scientific termination at 6 o'clock hours. Any interference by human personnel will be viewed as an act of aggression against the Union." Elias gripped the cub's neck, his knuckles turning white. He looked at the door, then at the security cameras. He was weak, he was wounded, and he was outnumbered. But as he looked into the cub's eyes, a look of fierce, death-worlder defiance took over his face. "They think they can take you," Elias whispered, struggling to sit up. "They forgot one thing about humans. We don't just hug. We protect what's ours." He reached for a metal tray nearby, bending it with his bare hands into a makeshift club. The hunt was about to begin, but this time, the human was the one doing the hunting. The medical bay was no longer a place of healing. It was a trap. Elias knew that in exactly 3 hours, the armored doors would slide open, and a squad of robotic enforcers would enter to take the cub. He looked at his arm. It was wrapped in a thick, white bandage soaked in healing gel. It throbbed with pain, but he ignored it. He looked at the Korgon Cub, who was watching the door with its ears flattened against its head. The creature knew something was wrong. It could smell the tension in the air. "We aren't waiting for them to come to us," Elias whispered. He stood up, his legs shaking. He was dizzy, but the adrenaline of a protector was flowing through his veins. He looked around the room for anything he could use. He found a small magnetic tool used by the surgeons and a heavy metal oxygen tank. Humans were famous for two things in the galaxy: their kindness and their ability to turn trash into weapons. Elias walked to the ventilation shaft on the ceiling. On this station, the vents were large enough for a human to crawl through, designed for maintenance droids. "Come here, Shadow," Elias beckoned. The cub hopped onto the bed and then onto Elias's shoulders. It was heavy, its scales scratching his neck, but Elias didn't care. He unscrewed the vent cover and pushed the cub inside. "Stay quiet. No growling." With a grunt of pain, Elias pulled himself up into the dark metal tunnel just as the first security alarm began to chime. Behind the glass of the command center, Commander Vark stared at the empty bed on his screen. "Where are they?" he roared. "The human is wounded. He cannot have gone far." The sensors began to beep. "Sir, they are in the ventilation system," a technician reported. "But there is something strange. The human is bypassing all the security sensors. He is using a magnetic tool to trick the heat scanners. He knows our systems better than we do." Vark felt a bead of sweat on his forehead. He had forgotten that before Elias was a diplomat, he had been an engineer on a mining ship. Humans spent their lives fixing broken machines. They knew how to hide in the veins of a space station. "Seal the deck," Vark ordered. "Do not let them reach the hangar." Inside the vents, it was hot and cramped. Elias crawled on his elbows, his bandage getting dirty. The cub followed close behind, its four eyes glowing like small lamps in the dark. Every few minutes, they heard the heavy thud-thud-thud of security boots passing underneath them. Elias stopped and held his breath. The cub imitated him, freezing in place. It was learning how to be a human hunter, patient and silent. "We need to get to the cargo docks," Elias whispered to the cub. "There's an Earth freighter leaving in an hour. If we make it there, you're safe." The cub licked Elias's ear, a rough, sandpaper sensation. It was its way of saying it understood. Suddenly, the vent beneath them hissed. A cloud of green gas began to rise from the floor. "Soporific gas," Elias coughed. "The Union was trying to knock them out." He tore a piece of his shirt and wrapped it around his nose. He took another piece and wrapped it around the cub's snout. "Hold your breath, buddy. Move. Fast." They scrambled through the maze of metal pipes. Elias's lungs burned. His vision began to blur from the gas. Just as he felt his strength failing, he saw a light at the end of the tunnel. He kicked the metal grate open and tumbled out, falling 5 feet onto a pile of soft shipping crates. They were in the cargo sector. The room was massive, filled with rows of giant metal boxes waiting to be shipped to different stars. But it wasn't empty. Standing at the exit were 4 robotic enforcers. Their eyes glowed red, and their arm cannons were locked and loaded. Human Elias, the lead robot, spoke in a cold, metallic voice. "Surrender the Korgon specimen. You are in violation of Galactic Treaty 741. Failure to comply will result in the use of lethal force." Elias stood up, pulling the cub behind his legs. He was covered in dust, blood, and sweat. He looked like a man who had nothing left to lose. He gripped the heavy oxygen tank he had carried with him. "I don't care about your treaties," Elias said, his voice cracking. "This cub isn't a specimen. He has a name, and he has a pack." The robots moved forward. Their cannons began to hum as they charged up. The cub stepped out from behind Elias, its back arching, a terrifying growl rising from its chest. It was ready to die for the human. But Elias had a different plan. He noticed a giant crane overhead holding a massive crate of iron ore. With a roar of his own, Elias threw the magnetic tool at the crane's control panel. The magnet short-circuited the electronics. The giant hook snapped. "Look out!" Elias yelled, grabbing the cub and diving to the right. The massive crate crashed down, smashing into the floor with the force of a falling moon. The shockwave knocked the robots off their feet, their metal bodies twisting under the weight of the iron. The path to the hangar was open. Elias didn't wait to see if they were destroyed. He scooped up the cub and ran toward the lights of the docking bay. He could see the Earth ship, the Spirit of Detroit, warming up its engines. Its ramp was slowly closing. "Wait! Stop!" Elias shouted. The captain of the ship, a gray-haired human who had seen the news, saw Elias running. He saw the bleeding arm and the small predator tucked under the man's chest. He didn't ask questions. He didn't check for a ticket. He just slammed the emergency open button on the ramp. "Get in here, son. Move your ass," the captain yelled. Elias leaped onto the rising ramp, his boots skidding on the metal. He collapsed onto the floor of the ship as the heavy door sealed shut, cutting off the sound of the station's alarms. He was safe. The Cub was safe. He lay on his back, staring at the ceiling of the ship, gasping for air. The Cub climbed onto his chest and began to lick the sweat off his forehead. For the first time in hours, Elias let out a real laugh. "We did it," he whispered, but as the ship moved into warp speed, leaving the station behind, Elias saw a message on the ship's view screen. It was a galaxy-wide broadcast from the Galactic Union. Humanity has declared itself an enemy of the Union by harboring the Shadow Fong. All human ships are now subject to search and seizure. The war has begun. Elias looked at the Cub. The little creature was curled into a ball, finally sleeping. He knew the cost of his choice was a galactic war. He knew billions might die because he refused to let one cub be killed. He looked at his bandaged arm, where the scars would always remain. "Let them come," Elias said to the empty room. "They think they know what war is. They haven't seen a human protecting his family." A spirit of Detroit vibrated as it tore through the fabric of space. Inside the crew lounge, Elias sat on a metal bench while a medical droid stitched the deep grooves in his arm. The Korgon Cub, now nicknamed Shadow, refused to leave his side. It sat on the floor, its 4 eyes tracking every movement of the droid. If the machine moved too fast, the Cub would let out a warning chirp. Shadow was no longer just a predator. He was Elias' shadow. "You've stirred up a hornet's nest, Elias," Captain Miller said, walking into the lounge. He handed Elias a cup of hot coffee. "The Galactic Union has blocked all human trade routes. They sent a fleet of 20 heavy cruisers to intercept us before we reach Earth's borders. They want the Cub, and they want your head on a platter." Elias took a sip of the coffee, feeling the heat return to his body. "They won't get either, Captain. Why are you helping me? You could just hand us over and save your ship." Captain Miller looked out the viewport at the swirling colors of warp space. "Because I saw the video, kid. My whole crew saw it. We spent years taking orders from the Union, watching them treat lesser species like trash. Then we see a guy getting his arm chewed off, and instead of swinging, he gives the damn thing a hug. It reminded us of who we are. Humans don't leave people behind even if those people have scales and 4 eyes." Suddenly, the ship dropped out of warp with a violent jolt. The sirens began to wail. Multiple signatures detected. "We've been pulled out of FTL." The pilot screamed over the intercom. Elias rushed to the cockpit, Shadow jumping along behind him. Outside the glass, the view was terrifying. 5 massive Union cruisers, shaped like silver discs, surrounded the small human freighter. Their weapon ports were open, glowing with the deadly light of ion cannons. "Unidentified human vessel," a cold voice boomed over the radio. "This is Admiral Krell of the Union Fleet. You are carrying stolen property and a fugitive. Power down your engines and prepare to be boarded. If you resist, we will vaporize you." Captain Miller looked at Elias. The situation was hopeless. A freighter had no shields and no guns. They were like a mouse surrounded by 5 cats. Shadow sensed the danger, his fur-like scales standing on end, his growl vibrating through the floorboards. "Wait," Elias said, pointing to the long-range sensor screen. "Look there, on the edge of the sensor map. Dozens of new signatures were appearing. They weren't Union ships. They were coming from the direction of Earth. At first, it was 10 ships, then 50, then hundreds." "Is that the Earth military?" Miller asked, his voice filled with hope. "No," Elias whispered, a smile spreading across his face. "It's better." The view screen filled with images of the incoming fleet. It wasn't a professional navy. There were rusty mining ships, sleek luxury yachts, old cargo haulers, and even tiny 2-man scout ships. Thousands of civilian humans had heard the news. They had seen the Human Choice video, and they had hopped into their ships and flown to the border. They didn't have heavy cannons, but they had numbers. A new voice broke through the radio. It was a woman's voice, calm and full of defiance. "Admiral Krell, this is the Free Human Merchant Fleet. We have a message for you." "You are civilians," Krell shouted back. "Move aside or be destroyed." "We aren't moving," the woman replied. There are 5,000 of us here. If you want that human and his cub, you're going to have to shoot through every single one of us. Are you prepared to kill 5,000 civilians over one animal? Think about what that will do to your precious Union. The Union cruisers stayed silent. The alien crews behind those silver discs were watching their screens in horror. They saw a wall of human ships, metal and glass, standing between them and their target. It was a human shield on a galactic scale. The humans weren't attacking. They were just there. They were refusing to let a bully take a child. Inside the spirit of Detroit, Elias watched as the thousands of human ships formed a circle around the freighter. It was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. See that, Shadow? Elias whispered, petting the cub's head. That's my tribe. That's humanity. For 3 hours, the standoff continued. The galaxy watched through live feeds. On worlds thousands of light years away, other species were cheering for the humans. The Union's image was crumbling. They looked like monsters, and the monsters looked like heroes. Finally, Admiral Krell's voice came back on the radio. He sounded defeated. Human vessel, you are cleared to proceed. But know this, you are now cast out. The Union will never offer you protection again. We don't need your protection, Captain Miller replied. We have each other. As the Union fleet turned and retreated into the dark, the thousands of human ships began to blink their lights in a synchronized pattern, the universal signal for welcome home. Elias sat back in the pilot's chair, the cub curling up in his lap. They were heading to Earth. But as he looked at the stars, Elias knew the peace wouldn't last forever. The Union was embarrassed, and an embarrassed empire is a dangerous one. He looked down at Shadow. The cub was growing fast. Its teeth were longer, and its muscles were getting stronger. They're going to come for us again, aren't they? Elias asked softly. Shadow looked up, his amber eyes intelligent and fierce. He let out a short, sharp bark, then rested his head on Elias's bandaged arm. He was no longer just a rescued animal. He was the symbol of a new era, an era where humanity would no longer follow the cold rules of the galaxy, but would write their own, starting with the rule that mercy is worth fighting for. Get some sleep, Shadow, Elias said. Tomorrow, we start training. If the galaxy wants a war because of a hug, we'll give them a war they'll never forget. 5 years had passed since the Great Standoff. The galaxy was a different place. The Galactic Union had not collapsed, but it had changed. The human choice had sparked a movement across 1,000 star systems. Other lesser species, inspired by Elias and Shadow, began to demand better treatment. They saw that the humans had stood up to the giants with nothing but a freighter and a hug, and they found their own courage. On Earth, in a quiet valley in the mountains of Montana, a massive creature moved through the tall grass. It was over 8 feet long, covered in midnight black scales that shimmered like oil on water. Its 4 eyes were no longer glowing with the red fire of rage, but with a calm, watchful gold. This was Shadow. He was no longer a cub. He was a full-grown Korgon Prime, the apex predator of the galaxy. Beside him walked Elias. He moved a bit slower now, and his left arm, though healed, bore the deep, white scars of the day they met. He didn't cover them. To him, those scars were the most important thing he owned. They were the price of a soul. Beautiful day, I assent it? Elias whispered. Shadow let out a deep, rumbling purr that sounded like a low-frequency engine. The creature nudged Elias's shoulder playfully, nearly knocking the man over. Even though Shadow could crush a tank with his jaws, he was as gentle as a kitten with Elias. Their peace was interrupted by the sound of a ship descending from the sky. It wasn't a human ship. It was a sleek, white diplomatic vessel belonging to the Galactic Union. It landed softly in the meadow, the grass bending under its thrusters. The ramp lowered, and an elderly alien stepped out. It was Commander Vark. He looked much older, his blue skin fading to a pale gray. He wasn't carrying a weapon. In fact, he looked nervous. Behind him stood a small group of young aliens from different species, students of the Galactic Academy. Shadow sensed the strangers and stepped in front of Elias. He didn't growl, but he stood tall, his massive shadow covering the diplomats. The students gasped, some pulling back in fear. They were looking at the monster of room 402, the beast that had supposedly started a war. It's okay, Shadow. Stand down, Elias said, placing a hand on the creature's flank. Shadow relaxed instantly, sitting back on his haunches. though his eyes remained fixed on Vark. Vark walked forward and bowed his head. Elias, it has been a long time. Commander, Elias replied. What brings the Union to my front door? I thought we were outcasts. Vark looked at the giant Korgon, and then at the scars on Elias's arm. The Union has spent 5 years trying to understand what happened that day. We analyzed the data, we studied the psychology, and we ran 1,000 simulations. But we couldn't find the answer in our computers. So, I brought the new generation to see for themselves. Vark turned to the students. Look at them, he told them, by all the laws of the universe. These two should be enemies. One is a killer by nature, the other is a fighter by history. But the human chose to break the law of the jungle. He didn't see a predator. He saw a brother in pain. One of the students, a small feathered alien, stepped forward. Is it true? She chirped. Did you really hug him while he was biting you? Elias smiled. He knelt down and beckoned the student to come closer. I did, but the hug wasn't for him. It was for me, too. It was to remind myself that I don't have to be what the galaxy expects me to be. We humans are dangerous, yes. We have built weapons that can crack planets. But our greatest power isn't our bombs. It's our ability to look at a monster and say, I love you anyway. Shadow leaned down and sniffed the small feathered student. The student trembled, but then she saw Shadow's tail wagging, a behavior he had learned from Earth dogs. She reached out a tiny hand and touched his scales. Shadow closed his eyes and leaned into the touch. The Union is offering you a seat, Elias, Vark said quietly. A seat on the High Council. Not as a diplomat, but as a teacher. We want you to teach us how to be human. Elias looked at the mountains, then at his loyal friend, and finally at the group of young aliens who were no longer afraid. He realized that the war he had feared had never happened. Instead, a quiet revolution of kindness had taken its place. I'll come, Elias said. But Shadow comes with me. And he gets his own chair. Vark laughed, a genuine sound of joy. I think the galaxy can handle that. As the sun began to set over the Montana hills, the man and the monster walked toward the ship. They were no longer a story of a bite and a bleed. They were the living proof that in a cold, dark universe, a single act of mercy can shine brighter than 1,000 suns. The video of that day would be played for centuries to come. It would be taught in schools on planets yet undiscovered, and the title of the story would always remain the same. Asterisk, the human choice. Asterisk, because when the galaxy expected war, humanity responded with a hug. And in doing so, they didn't just save a cub, they saved the soul of the universe.